없어요.
You're listening to the sound of Central Delaware, AM 530 WDDT Radio. Coming up next is Mr. Moribund's Scary Little Christmas. Keep your dial tuned right here to WDDT, AM 530. We're what's on when there's nothing on. Well, hello, Moribund. It's your favorite ghoul who's too cool for school, Mr. Moribund, with our second episode of Scary Little Christmas, our special Friday the 13th episode. You know, Friday the 13th doesn't happen very often in December. In fact, the last time it happened, it was in 2013, and the next time it will happen will be in 2030. And while we normally think of the number 13 as an unlucky number, in this episode, the unlucky number is going to be 90. I'll explain that in just a moment. For the benefit of those who may be joining us for the first time with this episode, Scary Little Christmas is a podcast about the ancient tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas time, a tradition that was lost several hundred years ago, and that which I'm hoping to reignite with the creation of this podcast. I have another Christmas-themed ghost story to read to you today, and it is called Number 90. It's by an author named Bithia Mary Croker. She was born in 1848, died in 1920. She was a very prolific novelist. She only wrote 2 ghost stories, this one and another one entitled To Let. And I haven't read that one, but it seems like she has a theme between the two of them of haunted apartments or haunted rentals. This story was first published in Chapman's Magazine of Fiction in December of 1895. So I hope you're ready to sit back, cuddle up with someone warm and cozy, or cold and slimy if you prefer, and let's enjoy the story Number 90. Number 90 by B.M. Croker. To let furnished for a term of years at a very low rental, a large old-fashioned family residence comprising 11 bedrooms, 4 reception rooms, dressing rooms, 2 staircases, complete servants' offices, ample accommodation for a gentleman's establishment, including 6-stall stable, coach house, etc. The above advertisement referred to a number 90. For a period extending over some years, this notice appeared spasmodically in various daily papers. Occasionally you saw it running for a week or a fortnight at a stretch, as if it were resolved to force itself into consideration by sheer persistency. Sometimes for months I looked for it in vain. Other ignorant folk might possibly fancy that the effort of the house agent had been crowned at last with success, that it was let and no longer in the market. I knew better. I knew that would never ever find a tenant as long as oak and ash endured. I knew that it was passed on as a hopeless case, from house agent to house agent. I knew that it would never be occupied save by rats, and, more than this, I knew the reason why. I will not say in what square, street, or road number 90 may be found, nor will I divulge to human being its precise and exact locality, but this I am prepared to state, that it is positively in existence, is in London, and is still empty. 20 years ago, this very Christmas, my friend John Hollyoak, civil engineer, and I were guests at a bachelor's party, partaking in company with 8 other celibates, of a very recherche little dinner in the neighborhood of Piccadilly. Conversation became very brisk as the champagne circulated, and many topics were started, discussed, and dismissed. They, I say they advisedly, as I myself am a man of few words, talked on an extraordinary variety of subjects. I distinctly recollect a long argument on mushrooms, murders, racing, cholera. From cholera we came to sudden death, from sudden death to churchyards, and from churchyards, it was naturally but a step, to ghosts. On this last topic the arguments became fast and furious, for the company was divided into 2 camps. The larger, the opposition, who scoffed, sneered, and snapped their fingers, and laughed with irritating contempt at the very name of ghosts, was headed by John Hollyoak. The smaller party, who were dogged, angry, and prepared to back their opinions to any extent, had for their leader our host, a bald-headed man of business whom I certainly would have credited, as I mentally remarked, with more sense. The believers in the supernatural obtained a hearing so far as to relate one or two blood-curdling first or second-hand experiences which, when concluded, instead of being received with an awestruck and respectful silence, were pooh-poohed with shouts of laughter and taunting suggestions that were by no means complimentary to the intelligence or sobriety of the victims of superstition. Argument and counter-argument waxed louder and hotter, and there was every prospect of a very stormy conclusion to the evening's entertainment. John Holyoake, who was the most vehement, the most incredulous, the most jocular, and the most derisive of the anti-ghost faction, brought matters to a climax by declaring that nothing would give him greater pleasure than to pass a night in a haunted house, and the worse its character, the better he would be pleased. His challenge was instantly taken up by our somewhat ruffled host, who warmly assured him that his wishes could be easily satisfied, and that he would be accommodated with a night's lodging in a haunted house within 24 hours, in fact, in a house of such a desperate reputation that even the adjoining mansions stood vacant. He then proceeded to give a brief outline of the history of number 90. It had once been the residence of a well-known county family, but what evil events had happened therein tradition did not relate. On the death of the last owner, a diabolical-looking aged person, much resembling the typical wizard, it had passed into the hands of a kinsman, resident abroad, who had no wish to return to England, and who desired his agents to let it, if they could, a most significant proviso. Year by year went by, and still this highly desirable family mansion could find no tenant, although the rent was reduced, and again reduced, to almost zero. The most ghastly whispers were afloat. The most terrible experiences were actually proclaimed on the housetops. No tenant would remain, even gratis, and for the last 10 years this handsome, desirable town family residence had been the abode of rats by day, and something else by night, so said the neighbors. Of course, it was the very thing for John, and he snatched up the gauntlet on the spot. He scoffed at its evil repute, and solemnly promised to rehabilitate its character within a week. It was in vain that he solemnly warned. One of his fellow guests gravely assured him that he would not pass a night in number 90 for £90,000. It would be the price of his reason. "You value your reason at a very high figure," replied John, with an indulgent smile. "I will venture mine for nothing." "Those laugh who win," put in our host sharply. "You have not been through the wood yet, though your name is Holyoake. I invite all present to dine with me in 3 days from this, and then, if our friend here has proved that he has got the better of the spirits, we will all laugh together. Is that a bargain?" This invitation was promptly accepted by the whole company, and then they fell to making practical arrangements for John's lodgings for the next night. I had no actual hand, or, more properly speaking, tongue, in this discussion, which carried us on till a late hour, but nevertheless, the next night at 10 o'clock, for no ghost with any self-respect would think of appearing before that time, I found myself standing, as John's second, on the steps of the notorious abode. But I was not going to remain. The hansom that brought us was to take me back to my respectable chambers. This ill-fated house was large, solemn-looking, and gloomy. A heavy portico frowned down on neighboring bare-faced hall doors. The caretaker, an army pensioner, bravest of the brave in daylight, was prudently awaiting us outside with a key, which said key he turned in the lock, and admitted us into a great echoing hall, black as Erebus, saying as he did so, "My missus has had the bed, and made up a good fire in the first front, sir. Your things is all laid out, and," dubiously to John, "I hope you'll have a comfortable night, sir." "No, sir. Thank you, sir. Excuse me, I'll not come in. Good night." And with the words still on his lips, he clattered down the steps with most indecent haste, and vanished. "And of course you will not come in either," said John. "It is not in the bond, and I prefer to face them alone." And he laughed contemptuously, a laugh that had a curious echo, it struck me at the time. A laugh strangely repeated, with an unpleasant mocking emphasis. "Call for me, alive or dead, at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," he added, pushing me forcibly out into the porch, and closing the door with a heavy, reverberating clang that sounded halfway down the street. I did call for him the next morning as desired, with the army pensioner, who stared at his commonplace, self-possessed appearance with an expression of respectful astonishment. "So it was all humbug, of course," I said, as he took my arm, and we set off for our club. "You shall have the whole story whenever we have had something to eat," he replied somewhat impatiently. "It will keep till after breakfast. I'm famishing." I remarked that he looked unusually grave as we chatted over our broiled fish and omelette, and that occasionally his attention seemed wandering, to say the least of it. The moment he had brought out his cigar case and lit up, he turned to me and said, "I see you are just quivering to know my experience, and I won't keep you on tenterhooks any longer. In 4 words, I have seen them." I am, as before hinted, a silent man. I merely looked at him with widely parted mouth and staring interrogative eyes. I believe I had best endeavor to give the narrative without comment, and in John Holyoake's own way. This is, as well as I can recollect, his experience, word for word. I proceeded upstairs after I had shut you out, lighting my way by a match, and I found the front room easily, as the door was ajar, and it was lit up by a roaring and most cheerful-looking fire, and 2 wax candles. It was a comfortable apartment, furnished with old-fashioned chairs and tables and the traditional 4-poster. There were numerous doors, which proved to be cupboards, and when I had executed a rigorous search in each of these closets and locked them, investigated the bed above and beneath, sounded the walls, and bolted the door, I sat down before the fire, lit a cigar, opened a book, and felt that I was going to be master of the situation, and most thoroughly and comfortably at home. My novel proved absorbing. I read on greedily, chapter after chapter, and so interested was I, and amused, for it was a lively book, that I positively lost sight of my whereabouts, and fancied myself reading in my own chamber. There was not a sound, not even a mouse in wainscot. The coals dropping from the grate occasionally broke the silence, till a neighboring church clock slowly boomed 12. "The hour," I said to myself, with a laugh, as I gave the fire a rousing poke and commenced a fresh chapter. But ere had I read 3 pages, I had occasion to pause and listen. What was that distinct sound now, coming nearer and nearer? "Rats, of course," said common sense. It was just a house for vermin. Then a longish silence. Again a stir, sounds approaching, as if apparently caused by many feet passing down the corridor. High-heeled shoes, the sweeping switch of silken trains. Of course it was all imagination, I assured myself, or rats. Rats were capable of making such curious, improbable noises. Then another silence, no sound but cinders and the ticking of my watch, which I had laid upon the table. I resumed my book, rather ashamed, and a little indignant with myself for having neglected it, and calmly dismissed my late interruption as rats, nothing but rats. I've been reading and smoking for some time in a placid and highly incredulous frame of mind, when I was somewhat rudely startled by a loud single knock at my room door. I took no notice of it, but merely laid down my novel and sat tight. Another knock, more imperious this time. After a moment's mental deliberation, I arose, armed myself with the poker, prepared to brain any number of rats, and threw the door open with a violent swing that strained its very hinges, and behold, to my amazement, a tall, powdered footman in a laced scarlet livery, who, making a formal inclination of his head, astonished me still further by saying, "Dinner is ready." "I'm not coming," I replied, without a moment's hesitation, and thereupon I slammed the door in his face, locked it, and resumed my seat, also my book, but reading was a farce, and my ears were aching for the next sound. It came soon, rapid steps running up the stairs, and again a single knock. I went over to the door, and once more discovered the tall footman, who repeated, with a studied courtesy, "Dinner is ready, and the company are waiting." "I told you I was not coming. Be off, and be hanged to you," I cried again, shutting the door violently. This time I did not make even a pretense at reading. I merely sat and waited for the next move. I had not long to sit. In 10 minutes I heard a third loud summons. I rose, went to the door, and tore it open. There, as I expected, was the servant again, with his parrot speech. "Dinner is ready. The company are waiting, and the master says you must come." "All right, then I'll come," I replied, wearied by reason of his importunity, and feeling suddenly fired with a desire to see the end of the adventure. He accordingly led the way downstairs, and I followed him, noting as I went the gilt buttons on his coat, and his splendidly turned calves, also that the hall and passages were now brilliantly illuminated, and that several liveryed servants were passing to and fro, and that from, presumably, the dining-room, there issued a buzz of tongues, loud volleys of laughter, many hilarious voices, and a clatter of knives and forks. I was not left much time for speculation, as in another second I found myself inside the door, and my escort announced me in a stentorian voice as Mr. Holyoake. I could hardly credit my senses as I looked round and saw about 24 people, dressed in a fashion of the last century, seated at the table, which was loaded with gold and silver plate, and lighted up by a blaze of wax candles in a massive candelabra. A swarthy elderly gentleman, who presided at the head of the board, rose deliberately as I entered. He was dressed in a crimson coat braided with silver. He wore a peruke, had the most piercing black eyes I ever encountered, made me the finest bow I ever received in all my life, and with a polite wave of a taper hand indicated my seat, a vacant chair between 2 powdered and patched beauties, with overflowing white shoulders and necks sparkling with diamonds. At first I was fully convinced that the whole affair was a superbly matured practical joke. Everything looked so real, so truly flesh and blood, so complete in every detail, but I gazed around in vain for one familiar face. I saw young, old, and elderly, handsome and the reverse. On all faces there was a similar expression, reckless, hardened defiance, and something else that made me shudder, but that I could not classify or define. Were they a secret community? Burglars or coiners? But no, in one rapid glance I noticed that they belonged exclusively to the upper stratum of society, bygone society. The jabber of talking had momentarily ceased, and the host, imperiously hammering the table with a knife handle, said in a singularly harsh, grating voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to give you a toast. Our guest," looking straight at me with his glittering coal-black eyes. Every glass was immediately raised. 20 faces were turned towards mine when, happily, a sudden impulse seized me. I sprang to my feet and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I beg to thank you for your kind hospitality, but before I accept it, allow me to say grace." I did not wait for permission, but hurriedly repeated a Latin benediction. Ere the last syllable was uttered, in an instant, there was a violent crash, an uproar, a sound of running, of screams, groans, and curses, and then utter darkness. I found myself standing alone by a big mahogany table which I could just dimly discern by the aid of a street lamp that threw its meager rays into the great empty dining room from the other side of the area. I must confess I felt my nerves a little shaken by this instantaneous change from light to darkness, from a crowd of gay and noisy companions to utter solitude and silence. I stood for a moment trying to recover my mental balance. I rubbed my eyes hard to assure myself that I was wide awake. Then I placed this very cigar case in the middle of the table as a sign and token that I had been downstairs, which cigar case I found exactly where I left it this morning, and then went and groped my way into the hall and regained my room. I met with no obstacle en route. I saw no one, but as I closed and double-locked my door, I distinctly heard a low laugh outside the keyhole, a sort of suppressed, malicious titter that made me furious. I opened the door at once. There was nothing to be seen. I waited and listened, dead silence. I then undressed and went to bed, resolved that a whole army of footmen would fail to allure me once more to that festive board. I was determined not to lose my night's rest, ghosts or no ghosts. Just as I was dozing off, I remember hearing the neighboring clock chime 2. It was the last sound I was aware of. The house was now as silent as a vault. My fire burned away cheerfully. I was no longer in the least degree inclined for reading, and I fell fast asleep and slept soundly till I heard the cabs and milk carts beginning their morning career. I then rose, dressed at my leisure, and found you, my good faithful friend, awaiting me, rather anxiously, on the hall-door steps. I have not done with that house yet. I'm determined to find out who these people are, and where they come from. I shall sleep there again tonight, and so shall Crib, my bulldog, and you will see that I shall have news for you tomorrow morning, if I am still alive to tell the tale," he added with a laugh. In vain I would have dissuaded him. I protested, argued, and implored. I declared that rashness was not courage, that he had seen enough, that I, who had seen nothing, and only listened to his experiences, was convinced that number 90 was a house to be avoided. I might just as well talk to my umbrella. So once more I reluctantly accompanied him to his previous night's lodging. Once more I saw him swallowed up inside the gloomy, forbidding-looking, re-echoing hall. I then went home in an unusually anxious, semi-excited, nervous state of mind, and I, who generally outrival the 7 sleepers, lay wide awake, tumbling and tossing hour after hour, a prey to the most foolish ideas I would have laughed to scorn in daylight. More than once I was certain that I heard John Holyoake distractedly calling me, and I sat up in bed and listened intently. Of course it was fancy, for the instant I did so there was no sound. At the first gleam of winter dawn I rose, dressed, and swallowed a cup of good strong coffee to clear my brain from the misty notions it had harbored during the night. And then I invested myself in my warmest topcoat and comforter, and set off for number 90. Early as it was but 7:30, I found the army pensioner was before me, pacing the pavement with a countenance that would have made a first-rate frontispiece for Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, a countenance the reverse of cheerful. I was not disposed to wait for 8 o'clock. I was too uneasy and too impatient for further particulars of the dinner party, so I rang with all my might and knocked with all my main. No sound within, no answer, but John was always a heavy sleeper. I was resolved to arouse him all the same, and knocked and rang and knocked incessantly for fully 10 minutes. I then stooped down and applied my eye to the keyhole. I looked steadily into the aperture, till I became accustomed to the darkness, and then it seemed to me that another eye, a very strange, fiery eye, was glaring into mine from the other side of the door. I removed my eye and applied my mouth instead, and shouted with all the power of my lungs. I did not care a straw if passers-by took me for an escaped lunatic. "John! John! Hollyoake!" How his name echoed and re-echoed up through that great empty house. He must hear that, I said to myself, as I pressed my ear closely against the lock and listened with throbbing suspense. The echo of Hollyoake had hardly died away when I swear that I distinctly heard a low, sniggering, mocking laugh. That was my only answer. That and a vast, unresponsive silence. I was now quite desperate. I shook the door frantically with all my strength. I broke the bell. In short, my behavior was such that it excited the curiosity of a policeman who crossed the road to know what was up. "I want to get in," I panted, breathless with my exertions. "You better stay where you are," said Bobby. "The outside of this house is the best of it. There are terrible stories." "But there is a gentleman inside it," I interrupted impatiently. "He slept there last night, and I can't wake him. He has the key." "Oh, you can't wake him," returned the policeman gravely. "Then we must get a locksmith." But already the thoughtful pensioner had procured one, and already a considerable and curious crowd surrounded the steps. After 5 minutes of, to me, maddening delay, the great heavy door was opened and swung slowly back, and I instantly rushed in, followed less precipitately by the policeman and pensioner. I had not far to seek John Hollyoake. He and his dog were lying at the foot of the stairs, both stone dead. Well, Moribund, I certainly hope you enjoyed B.M. Croker's number 90. That one had a bit of a grim ending, but there is some good news. I think he's going to get his security deposit back. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank and immortalize the fantastic patrons who have pitched in to help bring this show to you. There is Ed, who would be the first to tell you if he'd been bitten by a zombie. Kathleen, who paints with all the colors out of space. Kat, who befriends all the bats in the attic. Teresa, who always knows which candlestick opens the secret passage, and Nikki, who ain't afraid of no ghost, even though that's a double negative. We know that she's really not afraid of any ghost, but, it's implied. All of these patrons very graciously pitched in to help bring this episode to you. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so at patreon.com/Mr. Moribund, that's M.R. Moribund, or you can hit the tip jar at paypal.me/awkwardlabs. Or if you'd like to buy me a cup of coffee, you can do so at coffee, that's ko-fi.com/awkwardlabs. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please like, share, rate, and tell your friends if you enjoyed the show. And if you didn't enjoy the show, tell your enemies. For more information about me, you can go to mrmoribund.com, that's mrmoribund.com, to get info about shows, upcoming events. You can get links to the Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. And if you're a local Delawarean, please come out to our shows. They're only $5. You get to see a fantastic live show that features a classic monster movie, all kinds of entertainment. There's an art show in the lobby, all kinds of fun at a Mr. Moribund show. We do them twice a year, once in the summer and once in October. So please come out for those. You can find more information about those on the website. I'm hoping to get at least one more episode out before Christmas of 2019, so cross your fingers for that. And as always, whatever holiday you celebrate, be it Christmas or otherwise, I hope it is wonderful, magical, and even a little bit spooky. Thank you so much for listening, and sleep well, if you can. Mr. Moribund's Scary Little Christmas is written, produced, and presented by W.J. Walton, and is a production of Awkward Labs. All characters appearing in this work are fictitious, and any resemblance to real persons, living, dead, or undead, is purely coincidental. All original material and music is copyright 2019, all rights reserved. For more information about Awkward Labs, visit www.awkward-labs.com. Pursue happiness. Follow your bliss.